Nurses, what patient's final words stayed with you? As a Navy medic in Iraq, I witnessed more than my share of dying soldiers. Their last moments are seared into my memory. It wasn't always the words they spoke that stuck with me the most. It was the raw fear in their eyes. I can still picture their faces, terrified and confused as they lay there mortally wounded. Some of the men seemed to sense how badly off they were. They went peacefully, almost resigned, but others screamed in agony, their cries echoing in my head long after they took their final breath. One soldier haunts me more than the rest. He was only 21, his whole life ahead of him. When the bullet struck him, it caused a stroke. I watched helplessly as the left side of his body drooped and sagged like a rag doll. Through slurred speech, he begged us to let him call his family one last time, but out there in the heat of battle, we had no way to make it happen. That boy died without hearing his loved ones' voices again. I'll carry the weight of that day, that impossible request, for the rest of my years. Before delving into the next regrettable recap, please remember to like and subscribe if you'd like us to create more of this content. Thank you. Story 2. When I was just 11 years old, something happened that I'll never forget. My dad and I were driving to my friend's birthday party when we saw a motorcycle rider crash into a telephone pole. It was a terrible sight. My dad, who had been a soldier in Vietnam, didn't hesitate for a second. He stopped our car and rushed over to the injured man. He held the rider's hand and started to pray with him. Then my dad did something that surprised me. He gently told the man that he was going to die, but that he shouldn't be scared. "Think of all the people who love you," my dad said in a soothing voice. "Remember how strong they know you are. You've had a good life, full of love and happiness, and now you're about to go on a new journey." The amazing thing was, my dad had never met this man before, but the rider believed every word he said. It was like my father's kindness and wisdom brought him peace in his final moments. As the man took his last breaths, he couldn't speak anymore, but I could see bubbles forming on his lips like he was trying to say something. Those bubbles were his last words, and even though I don't know what he wanted to say, I think he was thanking my dad for being there with him. Story 3. When my dad was sick with colon cancer, he told me something that I'll never forget. One night, he said he was afraid to go to sleep because he had a feeling he wouldn't wake up again. It was like he could sense that his time was almost up. And you know what? He was right. That was the last night of his life. He passed away in his sleep, just like he thought he would. I went through something similar with my mum too. She fought so hard to stay awake, even when she was really tired. She told me she was scared that if she let herself fall asleep, she might never open her eyes again. We had to give her some special medicine to help her relax. Finally, she felt ready to rest. And just like my dad, she never woke up after that. It was like she knew deep down that it was her time to go. My mum's cancer made her really sick. We decided to let her spend her last days at my grandma's house, where we could all take care of her. As the days went by, she got weaker and weaker. One day, when I came to visit, she wasn't really responding to us anymore. She was having a hard time breathing because of the fluid in her lungs. My whole family was there, gathered around her bed. Even my mum's best friend from college had come to say goodbye. We talked to my mum softly, telling her how much we loved her. Grandma seemed to know that the end was near. All of a sudden, my mum opened her eyes and looked straight at her best friend. It was like she was waiting for that moment. Then, she closed her eyes again and took one last breath. Just like that, she was gone. I wasn't ready to lose her, but I knew she wasn't in pain anymore. Story 4. When my mum was in the hospital, she said something to my sister that I know must have been really hard to hear. Right before the nurses were about to give her more pain medicine, my mum told my sister to take her hands off of her. You see, my mum was trying to get out of bed because she wanted to go home. She was tired of being in the hospital and just wanted to be in a familiar place. It was like she had this sudden burst of energy even though she was very sick. My sister and I had to hold Mum gently and explain to her that she couldn't leave the hospital. We knew she was dying, but we didn't want her to be scared or confused. It was a really tough moment for all of us. I hope that my sister was so exhausted from staying by Mum's side that she doesn't remember those words. Instead, I hope she remembers how she helped to calm Mum down in her final moments. My sister had these recordings of our grandmother singing beautiful Polish hymns. She played them for Mum, and it seemed to bring her some peace. The sound of Grandma's voice was like a comforting blanket wrapped around her. Story 5. When I worked in a nursing home, I met an elderly man who taught me something important about living life to the fullest. We all knew he didn't have much time left, and he had no family to be with him. So my co-workers and I took turns sitting by his bedside, keeping him company. One day, as I sat with him, he opened his eyes and smiled. The sun was shining through the window, and the birds were singing. It was the perfect spring day. The man looked at me and said, "It's such a lovely day. Don't let this spoil it." His words struck me deeply. Even though he knew he was dying, he still found joy in the simple beauty of the world around him. He passed away just a few minutes later, but I'll always remember the peace and contentment on his face. He taught me that every moment of life is precious, no matter what. On the other hand, when I worked in hospice care, I witnessed a heartbreaking situation that showed me the power of forgiveness. There was a lady who was very sick, and as her time grew near, she kept saying over and over, "Not until they're all here, not until they're all here." Her family finally told us that she had a son whom she had disowned many years ago. They tried their best to find him, but they couldn't get in touch. It was so sad to see this woman crying out for her child in her final moments. She died without ever getting the chance to make things right with him. Story 6. I was there with my father-in-law Greg when he took his last breaths. It was a sound I'll never forget. Long, gasping breaths, like a fish struggling to breathe out of water. It was hard to watch him suffer like that. Even though he was very sick, Greg kept trying to pull off the sensor leads that were attached to his body. It was like he wanted to get up and leave, but he just didn't have the strength anymore. Greg used to be such a big, strong man. He was 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed around 300 pounds. But he wasn't just strong on the outside. He had a kind and loving heart, even though he could be a bit grumpy sometimes. In the last year of his life, cancer had taken a terrible toll on Greg's body. It was like the disease was eating him from the inside out, slowly and painfully. By the end, he probably weighed only about 220 pounds. It was heartbreaking to see how much the cancer had changed him. But even through all the pain and suffering, Greg fought bravely. He was a tough son of a bitch, and I admired him so much for that. I know he didn't want to leave us. But in the end, his body just couldn't keep going. Losing Greg has left a big hole in my heart. I miss him every single day. I miss his gruff voice, his bear hugs, and the way he always made me feel like part of the family. Story 7. When I was serving in Afghanistan, something really sad and scary happened. A rocket missed its target and landed in the area where our Afghan allies were sleeping. It hit the room of an Afghan field artillery officer, a great man who spoke 3 languages, and had a college degree from an American university. He was doing important work to make the world a better place. The worst part was that he was talking to his wife on the phone when the rocket struck. He was badly hurt and died slowly over the next 20 to 30 minutes. After they took his body away, the room got quieter, and we heard a faint, heartbreaking sound. His wife was screaming and crying on the other end of the phone. We realised that the phone call had never ended, which meant his wife had heard everything that happened to her husband. It was absolutely devastating to think about what she must have been going through in those moments. None of us spoke the same language as the officer's wife, but we didn't want to just hang up on her. Most of the people around us were either injured themselves or busy helping those who were hurt. So a few of us just sat there with the phone for a while, feeling completely helpless. We wanted to offer some comfort, but there was nothing we could say or do. Story 8. When I was in the hospital for over a month back in 2018, I had to share a room with different people. One of my roommates was a man in his late 50s who was really sick with pneumonia and some other health problems. One evening, we were just sitting there watching Jeopardy on TV when he suddenly asked me, "Did you turn off the lights?" I was a bit confused because the lights were still on, so I said, "No, the lights are still on." He replied, "That's not funny, it's really not for..." But before he could finish his sentence, he just said, "Oh." Right after that, he started having trouble breathing and gasping for air. All these alarms started going off, and out of nowhere, a whole team of doctors and nurses rushed into the room. It was crazy how fast they moved. Someone quickly wheeled my bed out into another room, so I didn't really know what was happening. Later, I found out that my roommate had died from a massive heart attack. It was so sudden and unexpected. I couldn't stop thinking about what he had said about the lights going out. The doctor didn't know for sure why he thought everything went black, but she had some ideas. The head nurse, a small but tough lady from the Philippines, said something that really stuck with me. She told me, "He was dying. You don't die all at once. Some parts die first." It was a heavy thing to hear, but it made me think a lot about life and death. I'm not sure if the nurse meant it to be as deep as it sounded, but those words, "You don't die all at once," have stayed with me ever since. It's a reminder that life is precious and that we should cherish every moment we have with the people we care about. Story 9. When I was working as a paramedic, I once responded to an accident where a man had crashed his motorcycle into an electric box near a stoplight. He had smashed into it pretty hard and ended up in the woods next to a forest preserve. Even though he was hurt, it didn't seem like his injuries were too severe at first. We treated it as a serious accident and took him to a nearby trauma centre hospital. On the way there, he was awake and talking to us, which was a good sign. But as we were pulling into the hospital parking lot, something strange happened. The man suddenly grabbed my hand and said, "I see the light. I'm dying right now." I tried to reassure him that he was going to be okay, but I could tell something wasn't right. We rushed him into the emergency room, but by the time we got there, he had passed away. It happened so fast and it was really hard to believe. The ER doctor was upset with us at first, yelling at us for not having the patient intubated, which means putting a breathing tube down his throat. But when I explained to the doctor what the man had said to me just before he died, the doctor immediately apologised. He realised that there wasn't anything more we could have done. Story 10. When my son was just a baby, he got really sick with pneumonia and had to be in the intensive care unit at the hospital. It was around Thanksgiving time, and there had been a terrible school bus crash in our city not long before. We were in the hospital with the kids who had been hurt in that crash. And there are two things from that time that I'll never forget. The first was the sound a mother made when her little boy died while we were there. It wasn't quite a scream, but it was the most heartbreaking noise I had ever heard. It was a sound of pure sadness and pain that I can still remember to this day. The second thing was the grandmother of a little boy who was in a coma in the bed next to us. Every single day she would sit by his side and beg him to wake up. She would tell him about how everyone was doing and how much they all loved him. She even promised him that he could have his Christmas presents early if he would just wake up. It was so hard to watch her go through that, hoping and praying that her grandson would come back to them. The good news is that the little boy did survive, although I don't know how well he recovered. We left the ICU before he woke up, but the news later reported on all the kids who had died in the crash, and he wasn't one of them. It was a small glimmer of hope in a really sad situation. Something else that really struck me was how incredibly kind all of these families were, even in the middle of their own tragedies. They had received a lot of food donations from people who wanted to help, and they kept sharing it with us, even though we were the only family there who wasn't part of the bus crash. They wouldn't take no for an answer, and they were all so genuinely concerned about my son and how he was doing. They would ask about his progress and make sure that my husband and I were holding up okay too. Story 11. When I was a young nursing assistant about 30 years ago, I had an experience that I wasn't ready for. I was taking care of a man who was very sick with something called sepsis, which is when an infection spreads throughout the body. He was getting worse, and we all knew he probably didn't have much time left. One day, while I was helping him, he asked me to do something that really scared me. He asked me to help him die. I was so shocked and upset by his request that I didn't know what to do. I gave him some ice chips to help with his dry mouth, and then I went on a break, but not before telling the head nurse about our conversation. Looking back, I wish I had handled the situation better. But the truth is, I was just too young and inexperienced to know what to say or do. We never learned about how to deal with something like that in my nursing classes. It was a really tough moment, and it left a big impact on me. Now that I'm older and have more experience, I understand that the man was probably in a lot of pain and feeling scared about what was happening to him. He might have thought that asking for help to end his life was the only way to find relief. But as a healthcare worker, it's not something I could ever do, even if I felt more prepared to talk about it. Story 12. When my mum was working in the emergency room, she had a patient who was an older man. He was very sick, and with his last breaths, he was saying angry things to his wife. It was hard to understand exactly what he was saying, but you could tell he was really upset about something. Later, we found out that the man had been poisoned. The police thought that maybe his wife had done it to get money from his life insurance. It was a really scary situation, and it showed that sometimes the people we trust the most can do bad things. I also remember meeting a farmer at a health clinic once. He was there because the doctors had found high levels of a dangerous substance called arsenic in his body. The police and the doctors wanted to test everyone in his family who lived with him to see if they had arsenic too. There were two possibilities. Either there was something in their environment, like the water or the soil, that was making them all sick, or someone was trying to hurt the farmer on purpose. It was like a real-life mystery, trying to figure out what was making him so ill. I never found out what happened to the farmer in the end, but his story has always stuck with me. It's a reminder that if something doesn't seem right with our health, it's important to get help and to tell someone we trust. Story 13. A couple of years ago, my dad was in the hospital and very sick. He had a tube in his throat, but he wasn't getting any better. It was a really scary time for our whole family. We had to talk to my dad about what he wanted to do next. The doctors gave us two options, but neither of them were good. He could either stay on the ventilator for a long time, probably in a special care facility, or he could go into hospice, which is a place where they help people who are near the end of their lives feel comfortable and peaceful. Since my dad couldn't speak because of the breathing tube, we gave him a pen and paper so he could write down his thoughts. When I read what he wrote, it broke my heart. He had written, "I thought I had more time." Those words hit me really hard because I could feel how sad and scared my dad was. He probably had so many things he still wanted to do, so many moments he wanted to share with us, his family. But his illness had taken all of that away from him, and now he was facing the reality that his time was running out. Story 14. When my dad was very sick, he had a stroke in his spine that left him paralysed from the neck down. He couldn't breathe on his own, so he had to be on a machine called a ventilator for 2 whole months. It was a really tough time for our family. The doctors told us that my dad wasn't getting better like they had hoped. We had to make a big decision. Either move him to a place where they could take care of him for a long time, or choose something called hospice care, which is when they focus on making someone comfortable at the end of their life. I didn't want to make such an important choice without talking to my dad first. So, with the help of a special nurse, we got my dad awake enough to use a device that let him speak a little bit through his breathing tube. I told him what was going on and asked what he wanted to do. My dad only said one word: hospice. It was like he had made up his mind and was ready to let go. It was really hard to hear, but I knew we had to respect his decision. Something similar happened to another family. Their dad had a stroke in his brainstem, which left him with a condition called locked-in syndrome. He could only communicate by blinking his eyes. He wasn't getting any better either. They had to choose between sending him to a nursing home with a breathing and feeding tube or removing the machines that were keeping him alive. They thought long and hard about what he would want, and finally asked him by having him blink to answer. He confirmed that he wanted the life support removed. Story 15. When I was in the army, I witnessed something that I'll never forget. It's a memory that still haunts me to this day. One of my fellow soldiers, who was very young, had been badly hurt. Despite the best efforts of our medics, it became clear that they weren't going to make it. In their final moments, they had one last wish: to talk to their parents back home. Using a special satellite phone, we were able to connect them with their mum and dad. As I listened, my heart broke at what I heard. With their last breaths, My friend apologized to their parents for all the trouble they had caused as a teenager. They talked about how much they regretted their past mistakes and how they wished they could come home to make everything right. It was clear that in that moment, all they wanted was to be with their family again. They wanted another chance to show their love and to be the kind of son or daughter they knew they could be. Their parents were in complete shock. They had no idea that this would be the last time they'd ever speak to their child. It was so sudden and so unexpected. After my fellow soldier passed away, I had to take the phone and explain to their parents what had happened. It was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do in my life. Story 16. I remember a really sad thing that happened when I was at work one day. A man suddenly had a heart attack and fell to the ground. He started shaking and twitching, and with his last breath, he said something that I'll never forget. "I am going to die at work." Despite everyone's best efforts to help him, he passed away right there on the shop floor, still holding the wrench he had been using. The ambulance didn't even make it in time. Story 17. I've been a nurse for almost 20 years, but one experience really stands out to me. It was with my own grandmother. Towards the end of her life, my grandmother had been dealing with dementia and Alzheimer's. In the last few months, she wasn't eating much anymore, and the nursing staff said we should start preparing for the end. My parents and I had gone out for my mum's birthday dinner, and while we were gone, we got a call that my grandmother had passed away. But the nurses told us that just a couple hours before, my grandmother had called for a single dish of peaches. When the nurse brought it to her, my grandma said, "Thank you, I have a long journey ahead of me," and then started eating the peaches. Those were her last words. It was such a bittersweet moment. She was clearly aware that her time was coming, but she was still able to appreciate the simple pleasure of her favourite fruit one last time. Story 18. I'll never forget the experience I had with my grandfather towards the end of his life. He knew he was dying, and I sat with him for hours as different family members came to say their goodbyes. The whole time he never spoke or acknowledged them. When everyone else had finally left and my parents stepped out for a break, he started squeezing my hand. I asked if he was in pain, but he didn't say anything. So I asked if he was scared, and that's when he turned his head to look right into my eyes. I told him it was okay, and that I'd be right there with him. He squeezed my hand again, and then whispered Ernie. That was the nickname for my late grandmother, Ernestine. So I started talking about her, telling him that I knew he must miss her so much, and that maybe he was just nervous rather than afraid. I even mentioned how handsome he looked after the hospice nurse had given him a clean shave, just the way my grandmother had liked it. As I was talking, his grip on my hand got even tighter. His eyes got really wide, and he started mumbling, "No, no, John." That's when I realised what was troubling him. John had been my grandmother's first husband, the one she was married to for 15 years before he passed away in a logging accident. They had loved each other deeply and had 5 children together. My grandfather had married my grandmother later on and treated her children as his own. They were married for over 50 years and had 2 more children together, including my dad. But now, as my grandfather's time was coming, he was afraid that he wouldn't get to see my grandmother because she'd be with her first husband, John. There wasn't anything I could say that seemed to bring him any comfort. He just kept whispering John over and over, shaking his head and looking around as if John was in the room. The best I could offer was, "John's got to spend the last 8 years with her. I'm sure she'll be more than ready to see you by now." But I could tell those words didn't ease his mind. It was heartbreaking to see him so worried in his final moments. Story 19. I'll never forget the story my aunt shared about her own mother's final days. My aunt's mum was dying from emphysema, and her 3 kids asked if there was anything special she wanted. Food, drink, anything. Surprisingly, she requested a beer. Now, my aunt's mum had been a recovering alcoholic for 12 years, so this was quite a request. But her kids knew how much it would mean to her, especially since it had been her late husband's own kids, who had done something similar for him when he was nearing the end. So they snuck a 6-pack into the hospital room and poured one of the beers into a plastic cup with a straw. When they gave it to her, she drank the entire thing in less than a minute, burping loudly when she finished. She immediately asked for another. Her kids poured her a second cup, but told her they'd hold off on any more until later that evening after dinner. Well, soon after, a nurse came in to give my aunt's mum some water, but when the nurse spotted the full cup of beer, she gave it a big sniff. Looking at my aunt's mum, the nurse said, "Oh, I guess you're not up for water right now," and handed the beer right back to her, even winking as she did so. The nurse then told the kids that her boss would be coming by in about an hour to finalise some paperwork, and she suggested they might want to go buy some mints. Story 20. Sometimes when I'm taking care of sick people, they tell me something that sends a chill down my back. They look right at me and say, "I think I'm going to die." And you know what? Just a few seconds later, their heart stops beating. It's so common that doctors even have a name for it, a sense of impending doom. Can you believe that's a real symptom? It's like the patient just knows their time is almost up. I remember one man who begged me, "Don't let me die," as we rushed him to the hospital. We thought he was doing okay when we picked him up, but he got much worse on the way. By the time we got there, it was too late. The doctors tried their best, but they couldn't get his heart going again. The saddest part? His family never got to say a real goodbye. They had no idea that would be the last time they'd see him alive. There was this kind old woman I used to drive to her hospice a lot. We knew each other by name and always chatted during the trip. Every time I dropped her off, I'd say, "I'll see you again," with a big smile. But the last time when I said those words, she looked at me and said something I'll never forget. Still smiling, she replied, "No, you won't." And she was right. I never saw her again after that day. It's like she could feel that her life was ending soon. Thanks for listening to these regrettable recaps. Please like and subscribe if you'd like more of this content in the future. And watch the video that's on your screen now for more regrettable recaps.